Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate. Today I'm interviewing
Syed Masood.
How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I am doing great. So, can you tell me about what you've written?
Sure. The book is called The Bad Muslim Discount. It is a story told from two perspectives. They're both immigrant stories. One of Anwar Faris, who has a more traditional route to immigration from Pakistan, and then one from a refugee fleeing Iraq and going to the Pakistan-Afghanistan border and then making their way to the States. They end up meeting in San Francisco in 2006, and hijinks ensue.
Cool. So, what prompted you to make immigration a focus of the Bad Muslim Discount?
Well, Mohsin Hamid once said, I'm going to butcher this quote, but Mohsin Hamid once said, we are all migrants in space and time. And so I've always felt that the migrant story is the human experience just condensed in a smaller period of time. And what Mohsin Hamid means by that, I think, is, you can stay in the same town your entire life, but, when you're 75 years old, the world will have passed you by anyway. So you will become a migrant eventually. It's just a matter of time. And so, I think the immigrant stories have always fascinated me because they condense the human experience into a short period of time, which has a definite beginning and a definite end. And writing about that is fascinating.
That sounds so interesting, and I love that quote, too, that you just shared. Can you also tell me a little bit about your book that just released in August, More Than Just a Pretty Face?
Yes, that is very different. That's a YA rom-com about a young man, Daniel Jelani, who is very handsome but not very bright. And so it's his journey of growing up and discovering that he is more than just a pretty face.
So do you prefer writing like the YA or the adult novels? Because as you said, the books are very different.
I prefer whatever I'm not working on at the time. So, if I'm writing adult, I yearn for the simplicity of YA and the purity of YA, because YA is the fiction of hope. I found it's the fiction of growing up and sort of starting out. It's a lot of new beginnings, a lot of firsts, and adult literature is the literature of discontent. You're either unhappy with who you are or where you are, and you're trying to find a way out. So they're very different ways of, very different perspectives, but also very different ways of writing. In defense of adult literature, you have, while the outlook is more grim sometimes, you do have a lot more freedom in terms of references and allusions you can make. You can cut loose a lot more stylistically. You can try a few more things. You don't have to care about, well, that's the wrong word. You don't have to be as hospitable to your reader as you do with YA. So simple choices, like in my YA book, whenever there are Urdu or Arabic words, I italicize them for the convenience of the reader. In Bad Muslim, I don't, because suck it up, you're grown-ups. So,
in all of my time, I talk about YA a lot on this podcast, and I have never heard it explained so perfectly. Is it's just like this depiction of hope, and adult literature is darker, and I really like that distinction. So, which one do you prefer reading?
Again, that depends on where I am. I usually do a lot of reading in whatever genre I'm writing right before I start a project. So I've been reading a lot of YA recently because I just finished another YA book. And if the next one is an adult, I'll read more of that. I think I prefer reading adult a little bit more. And I think that's just because of where I am in my life. It's I sort of oscillate, I suppose, just like I oscillate in terms of writing. I go back and forth, but with adult, I feel like there's more room for play with words and with allusions and references. I've always enjoyed that. Even when I was an English major, I really enjoyed that. So, for example, in Bad Muslim, there's a reference to Lot's wife from the Bible, and I can do that and not have to explain it in an adult novel. Whereas in YA, I would probably not use that reference, and if I did use it, I would have to explain it. Which is fair because the audience has the right to expect me to explain it. But when you're reading and you're just trying to have fun, I love allusions, I love references. So yeah, I do prefer a little bit more reading the adult side.
Can you give me a few examples of what references you like to put in books?
It's a lot of it is biblical, or Quranic, depending on your reference. So you see a lot of in Bad Muslim, you see a lot of Abraham and makes repeated appearances. Adam makes a few appearances in the book for references. I love those. I love referring to pop culture that's not necessarily American pop culture. So I do have references to Pakistani pop culture and Pakistani, the literary canon in Urdu, which is amazing, but obviously doesn't get the same play that the Western literary canon does. And I will say, as far as YA is concerned, we live in the golden age of YA. So I have found over the years I've been reading more and more YA because, you have brilliant authors like Angie Thomas and Katie Henry, Nick Stone. You have amazing authors writing right now in that space. And so I feel like I read more YA than I would typically, because these days we have such fantastic authors writing.
Yes. So back on the subject of YA, I've noticed that there's a lot of fantasy YA, and that's like a huge part of the genre. Do you think that you'll ever write in that space, or do you prefer writing in like the rom-com type area?
I get envious of the swag that the fantasy authors are able to get. So, they have some cool stuff. And I want the stuff. So, no, I'm kidding. Well, I'm partly kidding. Yes, I would consider writing it if I had a story that I couldn't tell using the world as it's currently constructed, the regular world, the real world, if you want to call it that. Simply because I like allusions so much and I like references so much, it's harder in fantasy to do that. So, for example, one of my favorite scenes in The Bad Muslim is Anwar, the protagonist, is wearing a T-shirt for the band, the Bare Naked Ladies, and his mom, who's a pious Muslim, was like, "What are you wearing?" Because she doesn't get the reference to the band. And so, that kind of joke doesn't quite translate to sci-fi or fantasy. I don't think you can do that successfully without doing an extraordinary amount of world building. So I think it's not naturally my strength, but I might try it someday.
When you were just saying that about the shirt, I was oh my gosh, I'm dying like inside laughing so hard at that because I do love the Bare Naked Ladies, like any sane person. But I love that you put those references in there. And that's something that I really like, where it's like authors can hide Easter eggs throughout their writing.
Right.
So you've lived all over the world, right?
Yes.
Has this influenced your writing?
I think it's influenced my worldview, and that's ultimately influenced my writing. I think one of the major themes in my writing is the fact that we're all human, and that's we all have multiple identities, but the first identity for me is the fact that we're all human, right? So, having lived in different parts of the world. And I can't say I've lived all over the world. I mean, I've lived in 3 countries and a bunch of different cities within the states. But what I found is people everywhere have similar desires. They want to be happy. They want their children to be safe. They want to have food. And now they may define happiness in different ways, but the basic human desires are the same. And so that is a theme that finds its way into my novels. And to my work. So I think it has definitely changed my work that way.
Yeah, and kind of piggybacking off of that, can you talk about the themes of like unity and like us all having like when it boils down to it, like everyone having very similar ideals?
Right. And I think people have different ideals because they have different values and different things that they value. I think what we have in common is our desires. And so the goals of humanity are common. I think the problem is that the ideals of humanity are very diverse. And so we're all working towards the same things. Is just we just define those things differently, right? And so, not to bring up controversial subjects, but let's say you want to talk about freedom and the freedom of expression versus the freedom of religion versus the ability of the state to regulate patriotic activity. So, for example, what I'm thinking of specifically is the niqab or the hijab in France, and how national identity clashes with personal beliefs and identity, and both of them are born from a desire of freedom, right? And so the person is saying, I want to be free, and the state is saying, we want to be free of religion. So they're the same goal. It's the ideal is different. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, totally.
So I think the conflict between people and civilizations is often because of the ideals and not because of the goals. I think what I'm talking about specifically is in this age of social media, we are all convinced that our ideals are right and the other people's ideas are wrong, whoever they may be, however the other is defined. And that leads to a loss of respect and a loss of decorum. I feel like the dignity of the other person in front of you is independent of their ideals because of the common humanity that you share. So there are characters in The Bad Muslim that, have some pretty extreme, some would say even vile views. And there are others who have very liberal views. And so they occupy the same space. And so there's conflict, but the basic humanity that unites them is still there.
Yes, totally. I just really hope that everyone listening to this is like really, really actually listening to this, because this is so interesting. So you earlier mentioned that like we all have like different identities. Can you talk a little bit more about like how you incorporate that into your writing and like make sure that the characters are fully dimensional?
I think you have to learn to love all your characters, even the ones that you disagree with or who are the villains of your story, right? I mean, the quote unquote villains in The Bad Muslim, the question becomes, how did they come to be who they are? And so you have to let the reader understand where they're coming from and get the reader to at least understand what shaped their ideals, even if the reader cannot and perhaps should not agree with those ideals. So you have to learn to love your characters and give all of them the opportunity to at least show, here's how I became who I am. And so even relatively minor or background characters like the landlord, who is one of my favorite characters in The Bad Muslim, there's a section where he gets to talk about why he does the things he does and the story of his life a little bit, because I don't think you can do justice to characters if you don't give them that opportunity.
Do you think that like reading and writing can help teach people to be like kinder to themselves and like listen to other people's stories more?
Yes, in fact, I did a little article for Little Brown on this very subject. And they've actually done studies that have found that people who read have an easier time with empathy than people who don't read. And I think it's because it lets you step into the shoes of different people and experience different lives, which you wouldn't otherwise. I think it was Seneca who said you can add as many years as you want to your life depending on how many books you want to read, because you're absorbing the point of view and the experiences of those people into your own. So yes, I definitely think so.
Yeah, I agree with that too. So kind of like off of this type of subject more, how did you decide on using like split perspectives in your books and traveling for two characters in Bad Muslim Discount?
That's a bit of a story. And so when I first wrote this book, I think right now as it's constructed, it's around 350 odd pages. When the first draft started at page 150. And
wow.
So yeah, it was the first draft was just one perspective, and it told the story from the middle of the story towards the end. And this thing went through a lot of work because it was my first novel, and I had more time because when you're under contract, you also have less time. But what I learned as I was doing it, I was talking to different people, and someone suggested, you are writing and this is going to sound egotistical, but I just want to say I didn't say this. The other person did. I was told you're writing the prototypical the Muslim American novel, right? And so you have to let it be as big in scope as it needs to be, and you need to write it in a way that shows the reader what makes these characters what they are. And so you have to start earlier. And so I sort of tried that, and then I tried the dual perspective, and it's not my favorite thing in the world, the dual perspective. As a writer, it's very challenging, especially when the voices are so very different between the two protagonists. It's very different. So I prefer having one perspective throughout because you can get used to the vocabulary, the cadence, the kind of examples and metaphors these people will use. When you're writing both, it's way more challenging. So it's not my favorite thing, but I think it worked really well for this particular story for what it needed to accomplish.
How did you make the protagonists knowing that they had to be very different from each other, but still like in the same veins that way it ties the story together? And still people that you had to like and to write about.
Well, I was lucky in a sense because I already knew the plot of the story, right? So because I'd written I'd written the middle and the ending from one perspective. So I already had the character constructed in my head for the second protagonist. So I had Anwar first, which I don't think is surprising to anybody who's read it. And then to make Safwa, I didn't have to construct her from the bottom up because she was already a side character. I just had to give her her own chapters and voice. And so when I went back, it wasn't all that difficult because I already knew who she was because I've written her middle and end. I just have to write her beginning now.
Oh, okay. So how did you select her to be the second voice? Like, because you said she was a side character initially.
Yes. Well, I mean, in a way, the question becomes whose story is it, right? And in a way, it's Anwar's story because, he is he is the one who is more American of the two. And so if you're going to talk about being Muslim in America, he's a vital character. But the only other character who can claim that this is my story is Safwa. And her story is obviously much more dark and more difficult than his. And it was more difficult to write for that reason because it was emotionally just absolutely exhausting. But she also had the virtue of being very different from him. So if you're going to write a dual perspective novel, you want the characters to be different enough that they're not going to sound the same. Because if they just sound like the same person, their voice is the same, their references, the way they speak, their sentence structure, if all that's the same between the two characters, then you're not going to be successful in writing more than one narrator. So she was a natural choice, not just because of her place in the story and her importance to the story, but also because she is in some ways one of the most different characters from him.
So I recently had an author on, and she had said that she felt like in writing in general and all this, you always put a bit of yourself into your characters. Do you find that to be true? And how do you differentiate enough yourself from yourself, essentially?
Right. Well, I think Anwar is the most personal protagonist I've written. I've now written 3 books. So I have The Pretty Face, I have Bad Muslim, and then I have finished a book that's coming out in September 2021, I think. Doesn't have a title yet. But the manuscript is done. It's in line edits now. So of those three, Anwar is the most like me. Well, 3 books and 4 protagonists, but Anwar is the most like me. And so for me, you know, his experiences just became a lot more different than mine. And so the more the story went forward, the crazier stuff started happening to him, and that changes the character. So I don't think you have to worry too much about, unless you're writing an autobiography, I guess. You can start with yourself. But I think fictional people are different from actual people in the sense that when I'm at least constructing a character, I look at 2 things. What's the character's great strength and what's their great weakness? And you have to have both. And weakness is probably more important than the strength. And so I don't know if anyone is self-actualized enough to be able to pinpoint all their weaknesses and strengths in a way to write themselves properly, which is why I think autobiographies are always a little slanted. You're not going to get an objective autobiography. But I think, once you construct the character and you fictionalize parts of yourself, they automatically start to differentiate from you. And then as the character has experiences and grows, they change over time. And I suppose it's easier for me because I don't plan out what's going to happen in a story. So as things are happening organically, the character organically starts to change. So I just have to hang in there and stick around long enough to see how it ends.
All right. So you wrote your book more than just a pretty face. And as you said earlier, it's like a rom-com. Do you like watching like rom-coms and reading that type of book?
I love writing. I love rom-coms.
They're awesome.
They are. There's a lot of certainty to a rom-com, right? I mean, you know how it's going to end, so you don't have to worry about it. It's not going to make you sad. Even though the characters are going through tough times, you know it's going to turn out okay. As a writer, it's a little challenging because everyone also knows how it's going to end. And so you have to make the journey really interesting. The suspense isn't in the what's going to happen, but in the how it's going to happen. So it's a little more challenging as an author, but as a consumer, I adore them.
Oh, yeah. Rom-coms are amazing. Also, this is coming from a teenage girl's perspective, but yeah. So you were probably like the 15th writer attorney I've had on here. I don't know. There are so many people who work in law that are also writers. Can you talk about how your career as an attorney has influenced your writing?
Sure. I think I quite frankly had a hard time in law. I was an English major to start off with. And then I went to law school. And I had a hard time my first year of law school as far as writing is concerned, because as an English major, you want to show off and you want to make, you want it to be pretty and you want to make allusions and references to everything. And in law school, they don't want any of that. So that's considered bad writing. Because the idea is to get to the point quickly and efficiently, and as simply as possible. So I had to learn how to do that, which I think really helped me. Because the way I write now is I try to use simple language for the most part. And I use flourishes. I still use them even in my legal writing, but I use them with a lot of restraint. So there's only one paragraph in The Bad Muslim where I just, one half a page, where I let myself just go, and there's this big kiss in the book towards the end. And I just let myself go, and I was able to do this grand flourish. And that has more of an impact because the rest of the story and the narrative contrasts with that one grand flourish, right? So you can have flourishes, but I think if those flourishes are contrasting with simpler writing, you can make big moments feel bigger. And I feel like that's something that law school gave me, is the ability to make big moments feel bigger, because my writing style has become more restrained than it used to be.
Oh, I like that a lot. So do you plot out outlines for your books? And like, how do you work when a curveball comes along, like, oh, wait, I'm going to make it split perspective now?
Yeah, I don't. I don't have outlines. I work off a blank page. It's not, for me, it's when I do the outline, it's kind of like I already know what's going to happen, so it's boring to me now. So I like telling myself the story. I like not knowing what's going to happen. So not so much with Bad Muslim, but with Pretty Face, it wasn't meant to even be a YA. It wasn't meant to be a rom-com. I was trying to do. Kafka has this, I think it's a short story called Metamorphosis, where the protagonist wakes up and finds he's a spider or a scorpion or something. I can't remember right now.
Oh, yeah.
But so I wanted to do that, but with a comic angle for Muslims. So I wanted the character to wake up one day and find out he's a goat. And then, he's dealing with his in-laws and they're serving him goat biryani and he's freaking out. When he's not in his goat state. I mean, it was a crazy idea. But I started writing this, and there was a side character who was one of the friends of the protagonist. And the more time I spent with a side character, I was like, you know what, this kid has something that is really interesting. So I sort of started then writing that person's story, and that became the Pretty Face. So it's a process of discovery for me. The person who talks about this the best, or in the most clear way, I think, is Stephen King. He has a book called On Writing, which really helped me. It really helped clarify my writing process. And so if anyone hasn't read it, they should check it out. It's the first part of it is his biography, and the second part is his writing process. And he talks about a writer being someone who's sitting in a dark wood, and he's in the forest, or she's in the forest, and a character comes out from the darkness, and they're holding a piece of wood that's burning, and they place it down in front of the author. And then another character shows up, and they're carrying a torch, and they place it in front of the character. And soon you have all these characters emerging from the darkness, and they've all placed their torches in front of the character, and what we have is a bonfire, and that's your story. And I think that is the best way I've heard my writing process described. I work in exactly the same way.
Without outlines, do you feel like it's more free for you to have the characters almost like speak to you for what like they would do in those situations?
Absolutely. It's very frustrating, actually, because you think you know how it's gonna go, and you start having like a mental picture of where the story is going, and then if a scene isn't working, is usually because you're trying to force the character to do things the character doesn't want to do. And so when you don't have an outline, I feel like you can let them be more free. You will write yourself into more corners, and you will have to disregard a lot of your writing. I usually toss out about the first 50 pages regularly, at least. And for Bad Muslim, I must have tossed out as many words as the book is over time. So it's a painful, difficult process. I don't recommend it. I imagine that I don't know if this is true, but I imagine that my contemporaries who plot have an easier time of it.
Do you ever get frustrated with your characters because you're like, no, you were supposed to be in this situation?
I used to, and not anymore, because I kind of realized that they're just being who they are. I used to get really annoyed, and I tried to make them, fit the mold, but not so much anymore. Now I've gotten to the point where I'm kind of resigned to it. It's like, okay, they're going to do what they're going to do. Just got to hang in there. And so, see how this plays out. Because if you do get frustrated with them and you do try to force them to do things they wouldn't do, they will stop speaking to you. And then you're really in trouble. So you have to just let them be who they are. Writing, in a way, to me, is just finding the truth, not just of the story, but also of the characters. And so you have to let them be in control. And I realize that probably sounds really strange to people who don't talk to writers a lot or who don't actually write themselves. It sounds like, we've got voices in our head. And honestly, we do, in a way. So, just got to let them be who they are and hang in there throughout their misadventures.
Yeah. So when you write, do you almost go into like kind of like a trance-like state where the characters are just like, they're just helping you along the way?
Ideally, usually towards the end of a book. So the beginning is the hardest part for me because I'm still struggling through, but by about 2/3 of the way in, now it's like it's all downhill from there because the story has now reached a point where there is going to be, I know who the characters are, I know what they're going to do, and I understand them, I understand the story. So it's all downhill from there. And so, for example, Pretty Face, I actually wrote it, I can't remember exactly, but I want to say about 3 or 4 months it took me to write it. And the last 30 to 40 pages I wrote in one night. And I was up all night, and I got up in the morning. I told my wife, "Here's the book. I'm gonna go to sleep now." Because I couldn't stop. Because it was all downhill. So that happens towards the end for me. When things are going well.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm trying to think about if I've got any more questions for you today. Did you have anything else that you wanted me to ask you, or anything you wanted to talk about?
Well, I've got the next book I've got coming out is a YA rom-com. It doesn't have a title yet, but it's about a young man who's raised by his great grandfather and homeschooled by him, and is very isolated, and he has to start going to a regular high school and learn to deal with the modern world when he has been raised in a home that's stuck like 100 years in the past. So that's been a lot of fun to write, and I'm hoping that people will enjoy that when it comes out.
That sounds cool. So can you talk a little bit about how you had to show that character all this new modern stuff and be around high schoolers in the modern era and reintroduce all the stuff that feels normal in our everyday life?
Right. I mean, and he does things that it's not even so much about him discovering the world in a way as the world discovering him. So he does things like, open car doors for people, which no one does for anyone anymore. Or he's using actual physical maps, and his friends that he's making are like, "What are you doing? There's an app for that." And so, there's it's in a way a novel about what's been lost. There's a line from a Yeats poem called, and it says, "The ceremonies of innocence are drowned." And so I think there's a question to be asked, though the book itself doesn't really focus on that so much, is all this technology good for us? What is the cost of the civilization that we're building? And so in a very sort of oblique way, the book does reference that, what's lost. And so it's his character is about having, he's very focused on dignity. So he doesn't like the idea of social media because he's like, it doesn't seem dignified. And he's trying to understand Instagram. And he's like, why? Why are we doing this? And what do you get out of it? So you get to ask some really cool questions when you're doing that story. So it's almost like he's been stuck in like a time warp and plunked into our current world. And he's having trouble understanding it.
That sounds so interesting. I'm going to have to read that. I'm actually also a homeschooler, but in a very different style. You could tell by me on this podcast and stuff. But I think that sounds really cool. So here is your section. You can just promote yourself in any way you want. What do you have coming up?
Well, I have the book we just talked about. I wish I had a title for you. I don't. The one thing I struggle with writing is titles. I'm terrible at titles.
Titles are so hard.
They're the worst. In fact, neither More Than Just a Pretty Face nor The Bad Muslim were my titles. My agent came up with The Bad Muslim. My editor for Pretty Face came up with that. I am awful at them. Unfortunately, we're all having trouble with the title for this next book. So I'm hoping that I will have that soon for people. But in the interim, I hope that people enjoy Bad Muslim. It's a unique book for me personally because when you start writing professionally, you start writing for other people. But the first book you write is always, as much as it is for readers, it's also for yourself. And so I'm hoping that people enjoy Bad Muslim. It's a personal book for me in a unique way because when I wrote it, I wasn't sure if it would ever be published. I was just writing it in part for myself. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy it.
Well, everybody go read all of his books. They all sound wonderful, and be on the lookout for that untitled one. I'm excited to see that. For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
And I'm Syed Masood.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The end. Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. This episode is hosted by Molly Southgate. It is edited by Rob Southgate and produced by Southgate Media Group. You can get in touch with the show at readbetweenthelines@gmail.com, or you can send us a voicemail at 708-887-9473. That was 708-887-9473. You can also find us on Instagram at Read Between the Lines Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.